Welcome back to Art Trippin lecture series. Today we will discuss the difference between medieval and Renaissance art styles. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin lecture series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. So let's start by looking at an example of medieval art. So here we see a really typical image from the Middle Ages, and we actually see the same subject matter well into the Renaissance and even into the Baroque periods. This subject matter is often referred to as Madonna and Child. Who is it? It's not Madonna the singer, it's Madonna, the mother of Jesus, and she's usually depicted holding little baby Jesus. So you may have seen some imagery like this, some medieval art, where baby Jesus looks like a little tiny burrito, or he looks, as in the case of this image, kind of like an old man shrunken down to baby size. And why did artists do this? It wasn't really just that artists weren't able to accurately depict the human form, but it was a conscious choice. Why? Because when we look at classical Greek and Roman art and remember, to Christians in the early Christian period and throughout the Middle Ages as Christianity spread throughout Europe, all of that Greek and Roman stuff was considered pagan. So they wanted to disassociate themselves from that. And we see instead in the medieval art style a style that's not about the human body, that's about holy figures. And these holy figures, even though they take on human forms, are really different from us and in many ways kind of far away from us. They're often depicted with a gold shining background that symbolizes the light of Christ and heaven, so that they're not even on earth with us. They're up in heaven. You will also see a lot of visible gold halos. This gold leaf is used to create these visible halos to indicate that these are holy figures. You will often see these figures, Mary and baby Jesus, surrounded by angels, everyone wearing halos, everyone up in heaven. Many times Mary is depicted as a sort of queen sitting on a throne, and then she's holding this baby Jesus who looks kind of like a tiny adult. So in some cases, he has a sort of receding hairline and the proportions of his body. He has a smaller head compared to a typical baby. Typically, babies have really big heads, and we'll see that when we get to Renaissance art. A lot of times, baby Jesus in medieval art is holding a piece of paper or holding his hands out in blessing, which are sort of very adult gestures. It kind of reminds me of that one baby that wants to go to the Four Seasons Orlando, like it's just a very adult gesture for a baby to do. Why is baby Jesus depicted in this adult-like way? Because we want to be reminded that even though he's a baby, he will grow up to be a man who, leads these people and eventually dies on the cross for, the sins of all humanity. In medieval art, in addition to this kind of shrunken old man baby Jesus, you will see in general that the figures are very abstracted. Mary here is depicted with this very elongated face. I mean, it looks like a human, so it's representational, but it's very abstracted. The eyes are kind of wide. She's got sort of no forehead. The fingers are very long, and the face is very elongated. So it's kind of an abstracted depiction of the human figure. And this makes sense because God and holy figures like Mary and God and Jesus are this concept, this abstract concept that's really far away from medieval people. We're going to see a shift as we move into the Renaissance where those holy figures are brought down to earth with the rest of us. Let's look at this Renaissance image by everyone's favorite Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, Raphael. So Raphael is known for his Madonna and Child paintings. This is a typical example of a Renaissance depiction of the Madonna and Child, or the Virgin Mary with her little baby Jesus. So how is this different stylistically? Iconographically, the subject matter is roughly the same. The main difference in terms of the subject matter is when we look at the medieval image, we see Mary sitting on a throne up in heaven surrounded by angels. Here, we see Mary has been brought down from the heavens, brought down to earth. And she's in a kind of typical Italian Renaissance era landscape. So you have to think of this as like, this is a depiction of Mary in current times. So I want you to imagine a tattooed woman holding a baby outside of a fast food restaurant. That's how contemporary this image is in many ways. So we see holy figures come down from the heavens and exist on the earthly plane with us humans. There's a great deal of humanizing of holy figures in the Renaissance. Now, we also see that naturalism that I talked about in the last video. And if you haven't watched the last video, go back and watch Introduction to the Renaissance. Okay, so in that video, I talked about naturalism. What is making this look like real life? Well, first of all, the artist has paid a great deal of attention to accurately depicting the body, the human form, and the proportions. Look at the proportion of baby Jesus. Babies are soft and chubby, especially before they walk, and they've got these like proportionately large heads compared to the rest of their bodies. And this artist has done that. You can also see the kind of chubby rolls and dimples on the cheeks of baby Jesus's little booty here. You also somewhat get a sense of Mary's body. You see a little bit of exposed skin on her chest, but not too much. She's always modest. But you kind of get a sense of her form, of her body and her breast and her waist underneath the clothing. So it's reminding us that she is a human woman. Now, both of these figures are depicted as white and blonde, and everybody knows that Jesus and Mary probably didn't look like this. So you have to remember that these Italian artists are painting these holy figures in their ideal, not actually historically accurate, right? Everybody knows Jesus was a brown Palestinian, right? But people often make God in their own image when it comes to imagining the divine. How else do we see that Renaissance naturalism in this painting? Look at the folds and the drapery. First of all, we've got these really bold, bright colors, which is thanks to this kind of new at the time artistic medium that is oil paint. We've got these really brilliant, deep, bold, saturated colors. And then look at the folds in this blue fabric and the grain fabric behind Mary. You can see the artist is using chiaroscuro, light and dark, to shape and model those folds. You can also see that, let's look at baby Jesus. You can see that on his back, there's kind of a cast shadow, also underneath his thigh, or you can look at Mary's face. On one side, you can see a bit of a shadow going down her neck. So there's like a light source that's shining in, and then like a naturalistic light source that's shining in and casting these shadows and helping to shape and model these forms and make them look three-dimensional, as opposed to in the Middle Ages where the light just sort of mysteriously emanates from all around these holy figures. Another thing that you will see is the introduction of the landscape into these holy paintings. So there's not a golden light of heaven here, but instead we see a real life depiction of the Italian landscape. And you can see off in the distance a little hill. You see a domed church with a bell tower. So this artist is really bringing these figures, these holy figures, into kind of a real life space. You will also notice atmospheric perspective. Look back behind Mary and you can see these trees and a bay and some mountains. And as those mountains and hills recede back, they become sort of blue-green, blue-gray, and hazy. So this is atmospheric perspective. So if you look at these two next to each other, we can say that the medieval style is much more abstract and the Renaissance style is much more naturalistic. Now, when we look at medieval art, we're going to see mostly Christian or religious subject matter, and we will also see that in the Renaissance, but we will also see, here's a new vocabulary word, secular art in the Renaissance. What does secular art mean? Secular art refers to art that is not religious, basically. So we might think of portraits. So here's a portrait, for example, by the Venetian artist Tiziano. Or we will see landscapes. So here is a landscape painting by Peter Bruegel. Or we will see images like this. This is Botticelli's Birth of Venus. It's a story from Greek mythology. So this is what we mean when we say secular art, non-religious art. So in the Renaissance, we will see Christian art and secular art. Okay, let's go back to our comparison. When we look at medieval art, we will really not see a great deal of nude bodies. Why? Because the body is the site of sin in Christian thought. Like, this is where humans sin. So there's this obfuscation and kind of rejection of the nude body in medieval art. You'll see the bodies kind of disappear under these heavy fabrics. I'm thinking of the mosaic of Justinian in San Vitale, and you could see all those guys with those robes. There's Justinian and the bishop and all of the military and the priests and the clerics all standing in a line, and it's got this fabric and you can't get a sense of their body. Instead, in Renaissance art, we will see an embracing and celebration of the human form. Just look at Michelangelo's David. This is a high Renaissance sculpture where we see the artist has paid a great deal of attention to depicting the human form accurately. And we will see that return of nudity in art, just like back in the classical era. And this interest in celebrating the human body is in part coming out of this field of thought that we know as humanism, where the human is sort of centered as opposed to the divine being centered. In medieval art, we see little to no human emotion, except for in some rare examples of Northern Renaissance Pietà imagery. In general, we don't see a great deal of human emotion depicted. In the Renaissance, we start to see some emotion, but it's still very restrained. Later, when we get to the Baroque period, we will see very dramatic depictions of human emotion. But the Renaissance is a kind of cool intellectualism, so we see emotional restraint, even though there's sometimes some emotions. For example, we'll look back to our earlier example from last video of the resurrection, and we see one figure burying his head in his hands as he's weeping over the death of Jesus. So there's some emotion, but somewhat restrained. When we look at medieval art, we see a less naturalistic or less real looking and more abstract style. And when we look to Renaissance art, we see much more naturalistic details. We see the use of chiaroscuro, light and dark, illusionistic space, so linear perspective and atmospheric perspective, creating a sense of a 3D reality on the flat surface. In medieval art, we often see very flattened spaces or no depiction of perspective at all, just sort of figures crowded into the picture plane without an attempt to create a sense of space. In terms of medium, we will see some differences. When you think of medieval art, you might think of mosaics or stained glass windows, but there are some paintings. You'll see wood carved sculptures, encaustic, and later egg tempera. So they're mixing egg yolk with pigment to create the paint. We will see that egg tempera used in the Renaissance as well, but eventually Artists in the Renaissance will start painting with oil paints, and these oil paints allow for much richer, much more varied and vibrant color palettes. In terms of medium of sculpture, we will see some shifts from the medieval wooden sculpture to a kind of rebirth of marble and bronze sculptures in the Renaissance. In terms of sculpture, a lot of medieval art is kind of relief sculpture, so door jamb figures attached to the portal of a Gothic cathedral, versus in the Renaissance, these sculptures will kind of come out into our space and will be meant to be seen from all directions. So the sculpture exists and you can walk around it and see it from all sides. To close this out, I want to show you two examples of architecture from the medieval period and the Renaissance period. So when we look at medieval architecture, especially the Gothic cathedral in France, so here's an example of Chartres Cathedral, you see tall, pointed spires and towers. You see kind of pointed arches and rib vaulting. You see stained glass windows and a lot of sculptural decoration on the exterior of the church facade. As we move into the Renaissance, here we're looking at Alberti's Sant'Andrea, which is a church in Mantova, Italy. We see this architecture is much more simple. We see a kind of return to Roman austerity. We see Alberti looking back to buildings like the Roman Pantheon or the Roman triumphal arches, and we see rounded arches instead of pointed arches. We see barrel vaulting instead of rib vaulting. We see triangular pediments that recall Greek temples, and an overall kind of austere or severe and much more simplified style in comparison to the dramatic Gothic cathedral. Hopefully now, through this video, you now have a great understanding of the difference between medieval and Renaissance art and architecture. Stay tuned for the next video in this lecture series where we dive into the Italian Quattrocento, the 1400s or early Renaissance in Italy. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin, the lecture series.